Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lovely Tuesday evening Zoom event where we are here tonight to virtually launch Dr. Karen Messing's latest book, which is entitled Bent Out of Shape, Shame, Solidarity, and Women's Bodies at Work. This book is published by Between the Lines Publishers, who's hosting this event tonight. And Between the Lines is a social movement press founded in 1977. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Jane McArthur, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. I'm coming to you from the Windsor-Essex region in Windsor, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations and a terminal on the Underground Railroad. I'm going to be very brief and just give you a little bit of an idea of our agenda for this evening. We will be having a little bit of an introduction of each of our panelists this evening. Of course, we have Dr. Karen Messing, Dr. Pat Armstrong, and Mary Shaw, and we will have more fulsome introductions by each of them later. We will hear from Dave from Between the Lines, and we will have a little bit of a presentation from each of the panelists before we'll move to audience questions. And you will be invited to submit questions that you might have for any of the panelists. You can do that in the Q&A function here on Zoom through the chat if you would like. And if you are joining us tonight on YouTube, you can put your questions in the comment section and we will all do our best to try to monitor the questions and get to as many as we can this evening. And just for your information, we will be recording tonight's event. So if you are so thrilled with what you've seen, you can go back and watch it again or let your friends know that they can find it later on. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dave Gray Donald from Between the Lines.
Thanks so much, Jane. So I'm Dave. I work at Between the Lines Publishers in Toronto. And so, yeah, I just want to say a few words about the publishing house and how to buy the book. And then we'll get back to the event. So we're a nonfiction publisher, and we have a long history of feminist publishing. So we're so thrilled to be publishing Bent Out of Shape. I really devoured this book when I picked it up. Just really powerful stories from workplaces, from women who are working and trying to transform their workplaces, transform the patriarchal design and work processes. A few other books that we published recently. This is called Women and Work by Susan Ferguson. It's a theory text sort of about social reproduction. Been learning a lot from this book. Book we published recently, originally in Portuguese, Plantation Memories, Episodes of Everyday Racism by Greta Colomba. This is a sort of foundational Black feminism text. This is Feminist City by Dr. Leslie Kern, about, similar to Bent Out of Shape, about how the urban environment is very much designed against women and against non-men. And actually, Dr. Messing and Dr. Leslie Kern will be in conversation together next Thursday evening, May 27th. I'll post the link to that. So for Bent Out of Shape, you can buy the book on our website, and I will post that link in the chat, btlbooks.com. And the book is currently available in physical form in Canada and the United States. It will be available shortly in the UK. The pandemic has messed up our global supply lines. We're really hoping it'll be out in June, but you can keep updated on that on our social media. The ebook, however, is available worldwide on our website, and it will be available on the Kindle and Kobo stores and all of the e-reader stores within 2 weeks. You can check back on that. For now, the ebook you can read using a program called Adobe Digital Editions. It is technically possible to use that to read on your Kindle or Kobo now, but it takes a few extra steps. So if you're a tech whiz, you can do it. If not, just wait a couple weeks. If you have any questions about how to get the book, if you want to place a bulk order, anything like that, get in touch with us. I'm at publicity@btlbooks.com. I'll post that in the chat. And the book is currently 10% off on our web store. Also, we would encourage you to if you can do curbside pickup from your local bookstore, support your local bookstore, and then you don't have to pay the shipping. That's enough from me. I want to hand it back to our host, Dr. Jane McArthur, who just completed a PhD in sociology at the University of Windsor and is the toxics campaigner with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So with that, and Jane, you could maybe say a bit more and how you're connected with Dr. Messing. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Yes, as for connections with Karen, I have to say I was thrilled to be asked to moderate this event. I have long respected Dr. Karen Messing's work, having first been introduced to her work when I was working at the Windsor Occupational Health Information Service. So I myself have been working at occupational health and safety and women's health and safety and women's health in general for quite some time. And as Dave said, I more recently completed my PhD, and Karen's work was pivotal in helping me to look at how the experience of women workers is very different in many ways, and not only in terms of their experience, but the way the system addresses women in their workplaces and the health issues that they face. And also, interestingly, my PhD defense, Dr. Pat Armstrong, who's with us here tonight, was my external examiner on that. And I was very excited to see that she would be a part of this, knowing that the conversation with these two would be fantastic. And then when I looked into Mary Shaw's work and what she brings to the table in terms of women's health and safety, I was just very excited. I know we're going to have a wonderful conversation tonight, listening to what Dr. Messing has learned in her work and what the other two fantastic women here are going to bring forward. So with that, I'll let each of them introduce themselves, and from there we will move to questions. So we're going to start with Pat Armstrong.
My name's Pat Armstrong. I'm a feminist political economist who is at York University in Toronto. And I met Karen because she came and knocked on our door in Montreal almost 50 years ago. And she said, I've read your book, The Double Ghetto, and we should meet. And I'm very pleased that she did, because I've been a fan ever since of all of her wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And next, we'd like to hear from Mary Shaw.
Good evening. My name is Mary Shaw, and I'm the Health and Safety Representative for the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, a local 175 here in Ontario. I've worked in grocery retail for 35 years, and I can personally relate to many examples of harm that women are exposed to in grocery retail. And many of those were identified in Karen's book. So from a simple design of workstation to the tasks themselves, to the bending, the pushing, the pulling, the reaching, the twisting, the turning, and the harmful chemicals that women are exposed to at the workplace, including cleaning chemicals and receipt paper. I'm very excited to be here this evening, and I look forward to the conversation from three outstanding women here. And
Thank you, Mary. And Karen, if you could now introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jane. And thanks so much, everybody, for coming to this event. I'm almost speechless, but not quite. I wanted to say, for who I am, I think it's crucial to mention from the outset that I'm a professor of ergonomics at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And I would not have been able to learn all I have about women workers without a very special program that the university has, linking community groups, unions, community groups, feminist groups with the university and providing resources for these groups so that the groups can ask for a study, they can ask for training sessions, and we professors can respond to them, and we get seed money from the university. We get course relief if we teach a course, say, in a union. And the fact that I have been allowed to be in such close contact with people who are actually making change has been the most important thing that's happened to me. Well, second only to me rapping on Pat's door and telling her about how I loved her book way back in 1984, I think it was. So I'm also very glad that Mary Shaw accepted our pleading with her to come to this evening, because UFCW, or for my Quebec friends, TRUAC, has been quite involved with an area that I've been concerned with as a researcher, and that is as Mary was alluding to, there's not only the chemical problems, there's a very serious problem with cashiers in Canada and the United States, because these are the major countries in the world where supermarket cashiers can't sit down. And this is an inhuman requirement that has no sense to it at all, and is symbolic to me of how women are made to do things that make no sense because nobody's thinking about their health and safety. I'm delighted that Jane accepted the invitation, and I'm going to tell you a secret that you can't tell anybody, and that Jane maybe doesn't know, which is that I was the anonymous peer reviewer for your paper on healthcare workers and the COVID pandemic, and I loved the paper. It's a great paper. It's a paper about how healthcare workers were betrayed by management from the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and Jane and her cohorts have been very active in this, as of course Pat has been active with healthcare workers for many years as well. So thank you for coming.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. So with our introductions out of the way, we're going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to give some specific comments about the book itself. And once again, we are going to start with Mary. Oh no, we're going to start with Pat, right? Okay, take it away, Pat.
Thank you, Jane, and Karen and Mary. I want to make 4 basic points about this book. I could talk about it actually all night, but I'll try and stick to my 4 points. The first one is that it's profoundly feminist. Excuse me, my allergies are getting me. It's feminist because it makes the personal political, because it listens to women's voices, because it makes it clear that bodies matter, and because it's focused on struggling together to, quote, adapt the workplace to our bodies and our lives, end of quote. My second point, it's profoundly scientific. The scientist's job is to bring those voices together, connecting them to the research, which is what Karen has been doing for a very long time. And the scientist's job is to look for patterns while always questioning who is included, how they're included, and from what perspective. Karen does all of that. And science, for us who are interested in gender and in sex, it's about locating the body in the social rather than universals. And it's about, finally, always questioning, even if you're still using words like yucky. Thirdly, it's profoundly relevant. It challenges assumptions of both scientists and all the other women who live in the bodies. It reminds me of a bumper sticker I saw a while ago that said, "Don't believe everything you think." But it always also made me think of, as I've told Karen many times before, when we've asked women about health hazards at work, we often hear them say, no, we ask them to take us through their history of work, and they talk about, and the history of their day, and they talk about how they have to go home at night and put their legs up for 2 hours because they ache so much. And we'll say, but you said there are no health hazards. And they'd say, lady, work hurts. And Karen makes it clear that it often does hurt. And in addition to being scientific and profoundly feminist, it's profoundly relevant. It challenges assumptions, as I was just saying, and it asks questions that relate to all women's bodies. It makes evidence accessible for all of us. And most importantly, perhaps, it suggests ways forward. Karen likes to say that she doesn't do theory, but I think this book is also profoundly theoretical. It tells us where to look, it tells us how to look, and it tells us what to do with what we find. And to me, that is what theory is all about. And she does it in a way that's not scary, as much theory is, and instead makes it a pleasure to read. Thank you. And thank you, Karen, for writing this book.
Wonderful, Pat. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Next, Mary Shaw, we'd like to hear from you, your thoughts on Karen's book.
Thank you, Jane. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the role it has played when it comes to harm to women in the workplace. And it's actually simply added another layer of harm. Harm to women in workplaces has existed for many, many decades. And I'm going to specifically talk about grocery stores because I'm very familiar with grocery stores. So let's start with something as simple as some of the chemicals that cashiers are exposed to. And those chemicals can be found on receipt paper. Receipt paper, specifically thermal receipt paper, was introduced in the 1990s. So for several decades, cashiers, predominantly women, have been handling receipt paper. And it may not seem that it would be harmful in doing so, but the chemicals that are on that receipt paper are readily absorbed by the skin. So the longer you have contact with that piece of paper, the more chemical is absorbed. When your hands are wet or moist, when your skin is wet or moist, the chemical is even more readily absorbed. So when it comes to cashiers handle wet products, damp products every single time they work. So they're handling produce that is wet. They're handling food items that have condensation on them, such as meat products or frozen food items. Cashiers will often use hand moisturizer because their skin becomes dry while they're checking out groceries. So that actually can increase the amount of absorption that occurs simply by handling the receipt paper. So with COVID-19, cashiers have been introduced to even more products that will moisten their skin, such as frequent use of hand sanitizer and disinfectant sprays that they're now being required to use. And often in many grocery store settings, cashiers are required to spray the checkout, the belt on the checkout after every single customer. So not only is this disinfectant going on their skin and potentially causing irritation, cashiers are also breathing in the fumes from these harsh chemicals. So once again, I mean, it's pretty simple when it comes to identifying the harms, and Karen has done a tremendous job of identifying the harms that women are exposed to in workplaces. And when it comes to the employer's responsibility, we hold all employers accountable. As a union, we're very much on the forefront of advocating for the health of all workers. And now, after reading Karen's book, I'm much more informed on the harms that are specific to women. And thank you, I appreciate your identifying all of the various harms, from the physiological to the ergonomic, to the drug, to the chemicals. And I think it's important that we really advocate for workers, and employers really need to adopt practices that prevent harm to women. And I believe it really starts with education. And I'm going to give you an example. Working in a grocery store as a female, if you're a cashier, the job is pretty much the same. And you can do the job. You're physiologically capable of doing the job. If you work in a different department that's predominantly male, such as the produce department or the meat department, if you're a woman and if you work in that department and you can't lift a 50-pound box of bananas, you're subjected to comments such as, why are you working here if you can't do the job? If you can't lift it, why did you want to come work in this particular area of the store? So there's not a great understanding of the differences between men and women at the workplace.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for really grounding these issues in the present moment. And next, Karen, we'd like to hear from you. You can tell us more about your book.
Well, first, I just want to respond to what Mary just said, because I really hope somebody is asking why the boxes have to weigh 50 pounds and why you can't make two 25-pound boxes that women who work usually faster than men could be manipulating in the same time. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we need more of in the workplace. And I think what I want to start out with is just saying why I wrote the book. And it's mostly because I have done some collaborations with different feminist scientists over the years. And we always end up disagreeing about, for example, should I be looking at biological differences between women and men? Or is that a really bad error because it'll make people think that women are inferior? Because of course, if we aren't equal, then we're going to be inferior. Nobody's worried that we're going to be found to be superior. I don't know why. So the arguments that I've had are just shut up about this. I remember particularly when one of my colleagues, Donna Mergler and actually Nicole Vézinat, two of my colleagues, wrote a paper on dysmenorrhea of poultry processors. These are women who are working in extremely fast. It's a very painful job. You're always overusing your joints, so you have terrible pain all the time. And it's a job that is usually done in the cold because the inspectors are worried that the chicken is going to start rotting in the 4 seconds or 20 seconds, I forget, that it takes the chicken to get from the beginning of the processing line to the end of the processing line. But nobody's worried about the freezing poultry slaughterhouse workers that are in there all day. And one of the effects of being exposed to a very cold environment is that when you get your period, I dimly remember that if it's cold, you have a lot of cramps, and your cramps are worse. And these people were actually having to miss work because of the cramps, which is not a normal thing. And so I got yelled at by some of my fellow scientists for mentioning this. And Donna and Nicole got yelled at for publishing it, because you're not supposed to make this kind of yucky statement about women, because we don't want people thinking about women's different reproductive cycles because then they won't get hired. And so I wrote the book because I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about our specificities any more than men are afraid to talk about their specificities. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily inferior. What it does mean is that if you have an entirely male population peopling the workplace, and you then bring women in, that maybe you want to give 2 minutes thinking to the idea that you might have to change something in the workplace so that women could be accommodated by it. And so I wrote the book to think about what are the differences, what are the areas in which there aren't any differences, because there are a lot of them. Not all men are different from all women. Not all men are taller than all women. Not all men are taller than most women. And there are people who don't like the categories men and women, and they have to be thought about too. So what is the biology of the people in the workplace and how that biology should be accommodated? So that's why I wrote the book.
Thank you, Karen, and such an important motivation. And as you said, the silence is one of the big problems, and that silence becomes experienced as the shame. And I know in my research with women workers at the Ambassador Bridge about breast cancer, a lot of the conversations centered around this problem and fear of talking about the concern not only of breast cancer, but other health issues in a very patriarchal and macho culture where women felt lucky to have those jobs because they were good paying jobs and they didn't want to create too much of a fuss. So the experience it's in all kinds of workplaces. And thank you so much for being curious about how can we talk about the biological issues and the sociological or social issues. So thank you again to all of you for your comments on the book. As I said, we will move next to questions. And I just want to remind Karen, Pat, and Mary that you are free, although I have questions for each of you, directed at each of you. If this can be more dialogical, that's fantastic. So if at any point you want to jump in on something that I've asked one of the other panelists, please do that. So I'm going to start first with a question for Karen. So your book is titled Bent Out of Shape, Shame, Solidarity, and Women's Bodies at Work. The title itself is packed with concepts that I'm sure we could spend a whole night on talking about. But as you've shown us in the book, all of these things are connected and they influence one another. Can you start off by talking about, when we're talking about and thinking about women's bodies and the workplace, where does shame fit in? And maybe you can talk about it from the point of view of what you learned in the third hour, which is the title of the first chapter. What did you learn in the third hour of your research? And what did that lead you to in terms of the question, what shame do we need to combat?
Thanks for that question, Jane. It's a great question. I think I should probably mention that when I was writing the book was right about the same time as the Me Too movement was starting. And I was confronting my own feelings about some things that happened to me in the past that were unpleasant, scary, and of which I felt very ashamed. And I had to interrogate, why was I feeling ashamed of things that were done to me? And it's a kind of a weird, I haven't figured that out yet, except that I know empirically that I feel very ashamed about things that were done to me, which I'm not going to tell you about, sorry. And that made me start the book with actually 3 chapters about groups of women in the workplace who felt shame about things being done that had been done to them. And the first group is a specific group, but it also reflects a more general problem that we've seen when women enter jobs that are called non-traditional jobs for women. That's jobs where most of the people in the jobs are men. And in the case of the jobs that we study, they're jobs that were mostly men and have a physical component. So in fact, Mary's example is a non-traditional job for women, moving things around in the produce department. And your story reminded me of one of the very first non-traditional jobs we ever looked at, which was the guy that puts the flour in the big vat thing in a cookie factory. And we asked the employer, how come that bag of flour had to weigh about 50 pounds? Because it's very hard to pick it up and put it into the big vat thing. And he said, well, I'd have to negotiate with my supplier to get it smaller. And that to him was an answer, which I didn't think it was actually. So the first chapter of my book is about women dealing with this kind of thing as communications technicians. They were people who put in telephone lines and repaired various kinds of communication lines, set up communication systems within buildings and so forth. It was, and when we observed their work and talked to them, we expected them to have some things to say. So we made a little meeting with all the women, and I say all the women, there were 5. This particular union had 1,273, I think it was, technicians in all, and there were 30 women total, and in Montreal there were 5. And these 5 women had never been together in the same room before to talk about their work. And so we had this meeting, and for the first hour, when we asked them things like, is your work the same as the work of the guys working along with you? And they say, yes, of course, no different. And is there any problems you have as women? No, of course not, no. And do you like your work? Yes, we love our work, and we really feel lucky to have this job. So that was the first hour. In the second hour, we started to see a little bit of people getting a little bit nervous, I guess, with our questions. And then toward the end of that second hour, they described a problem, which is you may have noticed that women have waists, and waists are a place where your body goes in more and then it goes out more, because we also have hips. And that means that if you have a belt around your waist and it's got a lot of heavy things dangling from it, your hips are going to start hurting after a while. They're going to start chafing. And so they did mention that it would be nice if there was some way to make their hips stop hurting. And I had a brilliant idea. I said, well, all you have to do, you just make a cross belt, like a sash sort of, going across your body. And then your shoulders will be bearing some of that weight, and your hips won't be hurting so much. And they all burst into laughter. They said, we're going to take a sash and make it outline our breasts, when every day, all day, we spend all our time making them forget that we're women. And now we're going to just stick our boobs in their faces. And from the point at which somebody said that, and it was actually the woman who identified as a feminist among them, the only woman who identified as a feminist among them who said that, then they started sharing the real stories of what it was like to work in this particular environment. And since BTL put online this afternoon a lot of that chapter, I'm not going to repeat it because you probably all got it, but they had a lot to say. And one of the things they had to say was one of them had been raped on the job and had never discussed this with anybody. So, and when she was being interviewed by one of my colleagues, Céline Chatigny, and Céline asked that question about, is there anything women technicians or have to say about the relationships between women and men at this job. And she said, no, women and men are the same. So there's a lot of denial going on because these women are trying so hard to survive that they don't want to spend any more time than they have to fighting these battles and telling people about these battles and thinking about these battles. But I suspect, and in fact, I've observed in other workplaces, that it's a very, very painful process in which they are always feeling like they're being looked down on, that they have to defend their place, that they must have been doing something wrong, that they must not know enough. And so it's the shame of being a woman is just crippling them. And when they were allowed to speak about it, when they got this permission, it just all came pouring out. I don't think we were able to do a great deal for these women, unfortunately. But with the book, I hope to do something so that women will not have to experience this in the future. That was a long answer.
That was a great answer. Thank you. I wonder if Mary and Pat had anything they wanted to enter in on that one. And if not, that's okay too. Okay, I'm going to move on and with that sort of somber and distressing piece of the story leads nicely actually into my question for Pat, my first question for Pat. I wanted to ask Pat about something she said in her review of Karen's book, where she said it was a pleasure to read. And so despite the seriousness of the challenges that women face in the workplace and the stories that Karen's research tells us about the women workers she studied, why for you, Pat, was reading this book a pleasure? Can you tell us?
First, I better put on my mic if I'm going to tell you anything. Well, part of the reason Karen just explained, in the sense that it's a pleasure because it's such a brave book. It's brave in not only telling her personal experiences, but also in and questioning her actions, which I think is really so valuable to us all. I think it's brave because she explores the contradictions. For instance, the contradictions of making the light and heavy work the same thing and the contradictory consequences of that, and to help us think through how our moves on trying to address what we see as the segregation may have unseen consequences for us. I think it's brave in raising questions about our actions and making us think through those actions. And I think it's brave also in telling us to think about our bodies in ways that we aren't used to thinking of our bodies, I think, in very, very ways. So it's a pleasure in that sense that it's so brave in where it takes us and how it takes us there. But it's also pleasure because it's all written in this plain, accessible language and with a sense of humor and a touch that makes you want to continue to read and to explore these many avenues.
That's a brilliant reason why it was a pleasure to read.
Jane, if I can just say one thing, which is I should have mentioned that everything I know about segregation of the workforce, I learned from Pat and her epic-making book, Double Ghetto. So just thought I had to say.
Well, I guess in that sense, you owe some of being brave to Pat. So, and Pat, you were able to find that in there, and that's great. That's just great. And I think bringing out what you did, Pat, with the contradictions, and I think that's such an important piece of the experience that women have in the workplace. And again, just to raise, because it's so fresh in my own mind, my own recent research with the women workers at the Ambassador Bridge, these contradictions and trying to grapple with these things, it puts all this added burden on women as they're trying to do work that's already difficult, and the shame and trying to be brave. These are all difficult work. So next, Mary, I'm going to ask you, as you told us in your introduction and your early comments on the book, you've been one of the public voices advocating around the exposure to harmful chemicals in receipt papers. And you talked about how the pandemic has exacerbated these exposures for cashiers. And of course, we're worried about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And these are in many ways very, more problematic for women in specific ways. What I want to ask you, Mary, is how have the exposures experienced for this predominantly women workforce during COVID-19 brought out the inequities and disproportionate harm to women workers that Karen's work helps us to understand? Can you tell us from your point of view?
So in the workplaces that we're specifically going to refer to as predominantly female are mostly grocery stores. And I believe with the pandemic, because the pandemic is so fluid, we're seeing policy and procedure changes constantly changing. So what's in effect today is not in effect tomorrow. What you're doing today, you're not doing tomorrow. So when I look at this situation, I find it very challenging that employers are not being proactive. They're being much more reactive. And I have read article after article about SARS. And should we have learned something from SARS? Absolutely. Have we learned something from SARS? I hope so. And if we have, why aren't we implementing what we've learned in workplaces, especially workplaces like healthcare? Again, workers who are deemed essential. They've been out there since the onset of the pandemic, and they've been struggling with health and safety concerns, with mental health concerns. So there's huge gaps in workplaces right now with COVID. And again, my greatest fear is what do we do when this happens again? Are we right back at step one and we're going to try to muddle our way through this, fly by the seat of our pants? Or are we going to, seriously take a look at what happened previously? What have we learned, and be more proactive?
Thanks, Mary. And I think that's really important that you're asking those questions. And I think we're all facing, wondering, what will we have learned, and what comes next? And I think this is also where Karen's book can help us to help recognize that these are realities that women are facing. And it's not just because of the pandemic, that these are longstanding realities that need to be addressed, and we have solutions. And one of the issues that really brings this out is if we look at the idea of undone science. So Karen, what your work has done, and what this conversation does, is it brings from the hidden places, it opens up the silence and allows us to see very clearly what it is that women are experiencing, what the harms are. So I wonder, Karen, as another question to you before we move to the audience questions, how do we begin to address this problem of the undone science of women's workplace health and safety?
Yeah. I was thinking, listening to Mary, about the fact that we're talking about the importance of chemical exposures of women in such day-to-day jobs as cashier, and of course in in healthcare, there's all these chemical exposures, and as well as all the infectious diseases. And yet there's been so little research on specifically on sex and chemical exposures, even on sex and disease exposures. And quite often there are, particularly in the area of toxic exposures, there are so many studies where there aren't any women. And it's not because women aren't exposed, it's because there may be fewer women in the workplaces concerned. And so people don't want to have to do statistics on small samples. But more often there's still a prejudice that says women have cycles and men don't have cycles. So we don't have to deal with cycles if we all have all male subjects, which kind of begs the question of what happens when these chemicals attack people with cycles. And we have so little. I mean, Donna Mergler has written a paper on this, and she's given a seminar on it recently, and it's not getting any better. So if you're talking about undone science, and I think that I should write a book called Undone Science, I think that's a wonderful book title. Then the question is how can we change this? And I can only, well, the things that made me aware of it were two things. One was that in 1969, I had a summer job teaching genetics at the University of Havana in Cuba. And it was the same time as a group named Science for the People from the US was visiting Cuba. So I got to know all these scientists who were interested in changing the world. And it was tremendously inspiring. And Science for the People has been reactivated recently, and they're so that people who want to know about how to use science to change the world might do well to check out what they're doing, their website and so forth. And the other thing has been that the ability of my university to put us in direct contact with women's groups who are asking for the knowledge that they need, from unions that are asking for the knowledge that they need, because it's the most educational experiences that I've ever had are learning how the real world works and what are the scientific questions that arise from that. And I think it's quite sad that we are the only university so far in Canada, or as far as I know, the United States, that has a program like this. And I think there should be more, because I think scientists really, it's a really cool thing that when you work with community groups, you learn about scientific questions long before the competition. And we learned about precarious work a lot longer than most other people did, because the unions came to us in the early 1990s and said, you got to do something about this. And then we were able to come in on the ground floor of all this research that's being done on the terrible effects of the terrible schedules people have right now. So I guess that would be my approach is if you want to do interesting science, you get as close as you can to the questions being asked, at least in occupational health, you get as close as you can to the questions actually being asked by workers, and then you try to answer them.
It just sparks for me, in terms of the undone research. There's so much undone research, but the one piece of the research we need right now is on the impact on women's health of working at home for pay, doing this paid work at home during the pandemic that has become so obvious. And I'm so fearful, and this is related to what Mary was saying about will we have learned any lessons coming out of this. I'm very afraid that the lessons will be the wrong ones we learn coming out of this. And we not only won't be providing the kinds of protections we need, but we will be moving backwards in terms of the kinds of protections. The other thing it makes me think of, you mentioned precarious employment, Karen, and the work you've done on this is really important. I think we have to also just look at more at the health consequences of that precarity, right? And the ways in which that is gendered as well. just for your next week's research.
Really
Yeah,
important.
you do this too, of course, Pat. So you might want to think about it yourself. But yes, one of Professor Melanie Lefrançois at the University of Quebec, who did her PhD with me and another colleague, has done some wonderful work on what happens to people during changing schedules and unmanageable schedules, and schedules that where you have you don't have enough notice of when you're going to work, and then this has led to actual changes in the workplace, which is what we all hope to do. The union was able to use the results of her research and make some changes. So yeah, I think it's important to be working in this area. Jane, you're muted.
Sorry about that. A few important things that I just want to quickly pick up on here is it brings me back to what Pat said about why it was a pleasure to read your book, Karen, was that the accessible language. And you said, Karen, that one of the things that we need to do to solve this problem of shame is we need to tell these stories through the women's experiences, and it is through the understanding of the practices and the day-to-day experiences and practices are what tell us. And without gathering these stories in the way that you have and talking about the everyday experiences, we can't move forward. So of course, we need to be doing the science that tells us the numbers and tells us the toxic impacts on the body, but we also very much need these stories. So thank you for that piece of that. I think what we'll
Can I just say something in regard to that?
Yeah.
I should tell everybody about ergonomics, because one of the important things about ergonomics and why I like doing it is that we don't only listen to the people, we also watch them work. And doing the actual observations, you learn more in a few minutes than you would learn listening to people, because people are not going to tell you that they're standing all day without moving, because it's what they do. And so, but if you're standing there watching them, and particularly if you're an old lady like me standing there watching them, you start getting a backache. And so you know that prolonged standing isn't good. But even when you're watching the movements, when you're listening to the interactions, both with supervisors and among the workers, you learn a tremendous amount of what the strategies are that people use to get through their workday, and how important all the constraints are on their jobs. And the other thing that you learn that's really important, that a lot of scientists have not had the opportunity to realize, is how much work is about teamwork, collective work, interaction, people helping each other, because so much of interaction and helping each other is informal, and even sometimes you're not supposed to do it. So when you're watching people for long periods of time, you learn tremendous amount about the little changes you can make to make people's work easier. For example, that it's easier for two people to lift something than for one person to lift something. You'd think people would know that, but sometimes supervisors don't know that.
Thank you for that. Also very important.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Mary. Go ahead,
I just
Mary.
like to add something to that, because when I talk to workers who are injured, cashiers who experience a lot of repetitive strain injury as a result of their job, and I ask them, how would you describe what you do? Because your doctor needs to know what you do at the workplace. So if you go to the doctor and say, well, I'm a cashier, your doctor is not going to have any idea of what that means. So how would you describe your job? Tell the doctor exactly what you do at your job. And then when they actually start describing, they realized that they were doing a lot of physical work. There's a lot of discomfort. There's the prolonged standing, the way that they're moving, the area that they work in is very small and confined. And now with COVID, they're surrounded by plexiglass. It's warm in there. The air is a little bit stale. So when they actually embrace all of the aspects of their job, I see a difference in the way that they look at their task. It's almost as if they're, I don't know if they're not aware, but I think there's a sense of shame that when you say I'm a cashier, you're embarrassed or you're shameful that you have a menial job such as that. But when you really get into the meat and potatoes of it, it's a pretty tough job to do.
Well, and I think it's also that you have to go back and do that tomorrow, right? So if you think about all of those things, it's very hard to go back and it's even harder to go back to it tomorrow, right?
So important.
Yeah, I found that people don't really like you to ask them, particularly when I was young and innocent, around 60 or so, I had just discovered that cashiers stood all day and that they lifted heavy weights all day. And so I used to go to my local supermarket and make remarks about this. And I quickly realized that that made people very angry at me. And because people don't like to be faced with the fact that their jobs hurt, because I'm not going to pay them a salary. You know, this snotty lady that in this client is not going to pay them a salary to stay home. So what's the use of my bringing it up when I can't change anything?
Yeah.
I think
Well,
I
yeah,
was just
go
going to
ahead.
add something else. The other thing that I think is another of the many things that I think is really important in Karen's work is revealing the extent to which many of the jobs we think of as having no health hazards whatsoever, like teaching, is what the example from Karen's work, one of the many I always used in my classes was, we think of school teachers as what could be a safer job. And yet Karen maybe can talk about what her research has revealed about the safety in that.
I hope you tell your students that I stole the title from you. That's one of the acts in my life that are I'm most ashamed of, because the title of the article about teachers is the 122nd minute, because teachers are constantly having to deal with demands from all 30 or so of the kids in their classes while dealing with an extremely bad environment. We've learned about this through COVID, because the denial of aerosols, at least in my province, meant that nobody was really looking at transmission in classrooms, and nobody was dealing with the fact that ventilation in, I think it's 54% of schools in Quebec have inadequate ventilation. And that's why the tricky mathematics of the provincial minister of education, because it's probably a lot more than that. We were in no classrooms that were comfortable. And so when the classroom is uncomfortable, the teacher is dealing with kids who need to get up and get a glass of water because it's too hot, and kids that are fidgety because they're uncomfortable. And of course now kids that are getting COVID because the air isn't circulating correctly. So it's a profession which is having, at least again in Quebec, a tremendous amount of trouble recruiting people to work there. In fact, today in the paper, there was an article about the fact that unqualified teachers are now generally working all over the province because there's a shortage of teachers. And one of the reasons for the shortage of teachers is, yes, some of the teachers are old enough that COVID is a real threat for them and they don't want to work during COVID. But there's another reason, which is that over the first 5 years of teaching, I think it's half of teachers leave their profession because it's just a really tough job. It's a tough job because they've been cutting back on the support staff, the technical education assistants that help with children with special needs, the people who are helping with children who can't speak, whose native language is not the language that they're being taught in. So that it's a really demanding job. And the other thing people don't appreciate about it is the work schedules, which look really easy. I mean, in newspapers regularly, you hear people complaining about these teachers who have only got to work a few months in the year, and they only have a 25-hour-a-week work week. And this is a big lie, because teachers are thinking all the time about the job. Plus, they're spending tremendous amounts of time preparing the job. The correcting papers and so forth is all done at home. And it's all done on, by the way, on computers that they have to buy for themselves because the schools aren't properly provided. Anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I'm suddenly reminded of the fact that that's not this book. This is actually a book that I wrote before this book, which you should all go and buy from BTO as well. So I'll stop talking about teachers, but yes.
Really good way of illustrating, though, the same problems that you're bringing out. And of course, at this moment, we're all well aware of what's, or hopefully those of us who are attuned to it, what teachers are facing and what this has brought out. And again, where we need to be thinking about what can we do better, build better moving forward. This has been a wonderful conversation between the three of you. I want to give an opportunity to some of the attendees who are here with us tonight to have some of their questions answered as well. So I'm going to go to the first question that was put in the chat tonight. It's from Dorothy Wigmore, who says that Pat and Karen were at Health Canada's meetings about women's health in the early 1990s. What has changed in how you analyze and understand women's job-related health hazards and how they are understood by others?
Pat's not saying anything, so I guess I have to. I guess the short answer is a little and not enough has changed. Though in the 1990s, there was Health Canada had a women's bureau, which they cut a few years later, sadly. And the head of that bureau was Frida Paltil, who was the late Frida Paltil, who did a wonderful job of getting women scientists together to discuss, and men scientists as well, together to discuss women's health. And out of those discussions that we had came, among other things, over time, the Institute for Gender and Health of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And it hasn't solved the problem. There's not an awful lot of occupational health research that's being supported by the CIHR, but there is much more than there was in 1990, that's for sure. And so, and right now, as we speak, there's a program, a research program that's being supported on what is the good about teaching about gender. How does that improve the health of Canadians? How does applying a gender lens to health research improve the health of Canadians? And there's, I think, 6 research teams working on this, and one of them is on occupational health, led by Marie Laberge. And we're learning all kinds of things about what's important to do research on, the kinds of questions that we need to ask both our students and the people we're doing research with around their exposures to risk and their health problems. So certainly the fact that the Institute for Gender and Health was established is an important consequence. At Shirk, Pat could talk about this more than me because she was the head of a committee on women's studies, if I remember correctly. And we had some research on health, women's health, and certainly Pat's own group has been supported for, what's it going to be, 30 years, something like that, 35 years, 40 years, okay. Anyway, a long time, and they're publishing books at a rate that I can't read them all, but I'm going to try. And we're learning a lot about healthcare workers that we certainly didn't know before. So yeah, it's not hopeless. It's getting better. And of course, Dorothy's working in this herself, so she should probably answer her own question.
I think I'm sure Dorothy would agree as well that we have made some progress, as you've said, although, and one of the ways I think we've made progress is that it's not as often required that you have to do everything as a comparison. That you don't always have to compare women and men, that you can look at women's issues as women's issues without arguing that they're worse than men's or not as much as men's, or that you need to be equal to men in order to make that work. Although I have to say I was on a CIHR committee not so long ago when the issue was research on the homeless, and gender wasn't mentioned once. And when I raised this, I was told, well, that's because they're men. And there wasn't a single place in any of these applications that said anything about men. It said homeless. When we know for that, I supervised a thesis actually that was on homeless women and the very different kinds of issues they have, like men don't menstruate, at least. And that becomes a significantly different issue. So I think we made some progress. I think we made some progress on recognizing, at least talking about violence and racism. I'm not sure how much progress we've made in actually addressing those things, but I think we're making small steps forward. But again, to go back to Mary's example of SARS, will we lose all those as we come out of this recession? And the Women's Health Bureau is not really there anymore.
Thank you, Pat. Mary, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pick up another question from the question and answer here on Zoom. I'm going to ask Elaine's question. Karen, how do you hope that your book will be used, and how can we help make that happen?
Yeah, just for the very few people who don't know who Elaine is, she's a feminist economist, and those are quite thin on the ground. So we are grateful that Elaine is doing all the wonderful work that she does. And she, although despite being an American, she's still working a lot on Canadian data. So we should really be paying attention to her work. I think what I want you to do, I don't know that I would want you to do you yourself to do anything differently, but I think it would be nice if people in academia taught a little bit more about women, because there's a fair amount of research now coming out, but I'm not sure it's making its way into the classrooms. And I say this because part of what our research group did was an attempt to make sure that gender was being included in ergonomics teaching. And we're going to be, Marie Laberge and her colleagues are going to be publishing an article on this, and they'll be presenting also at the International Ergonomics Association conference. If you don't have a teacher who's committed to thinking about gender all during the semester, having somebody come in and just give 1 3-hour lecture on it is not going to do it, because the students will think that they're not being evaluated on it, because the students just won't be reminded of it. And it's not natural enough for people to think about gender. So there really has to be some kind of concerted effort to make sure that the teaching about gender gets integrated into the curriculum.
Fantastic. Yes, agree. I'm going to bring up another question that brings us back to where we started, and it's on shame. So the question is, shame is such an interesting concept that is used against women, like avoiding crossover straps that outline breasts, or needing bathroom breaks, or avoiding dysmenorrhea. How do we address this in ways that strengthen women's strength to ask for what we need?
I hope nobody thinks I have an answer for that. I wish I knew. But I guess the answer I'm trying to put forward in the book is that we have to encourage each other, that we have to be supportive to each other, and in the sense that solidarity, which is not as easy as it sounds, supporting other women, getting together with other women. I mean, I tell a story in the book about how at one point Donna Mergler and I, Donna's a toxicologist, and she and I were the only women in our biology department. And at the beginning, everybody warned me against her, and everybody warned her against me, all the guys. And it was very effective. I learned to want to be the good woman, and I'm sure she was thinking, well, I'm going to be a good woman. And what a good woman was somebody that didn't trouble all these other guys. And then various things happened that brought us together and made us realize that we could make common cause. And we built a research center out of it, and did a lot of other things together. And the fact that there were two of us and that we could confide in each other when terrible things happened to us. I mean, the head of a research institute was really mean to us and told us that we couldn't be the heads of a research team, and that we certainly couldn't do it together, and that every team needed a locomotive. And so Donna and I did a little locomotive dance. But there's a lot of obstacles to women getting together. And I think that it's important that we learn to somehow to overcome them, and to still the little voices in our heads telling us that we're silly, and when women get together, they just don't do anything important, and we're not able to build things together. We need a guy, and all those little voices, we got to tell them to shut up.
I think that's so true. So very true. Pat, Mary, any comments on that final question on shame? I like, Karen, that you brought us back to solidarity there. And I really have a sense right now, actually, of solidarity. This book that you've written, this such an important book, has brought so many of us here together tonight. The three of you, Karen, Mary, Pat, very powerful women's voices who are advocating powerfully for women. All three of you are brave. And Karen, I think that you've done such an important thing for so many of us who are working on these issues, but for all the women who are working and who are working in silence and who are working with shame. So I hope that from here, we can move forward in solidarity, continue this work, and reshape a future that, maybe that is what comes out of COVID, and maybe that is what comes out of this work, that we have a greater movement for solidarity among women and talking about women's issues. And these, as we all know, as feminists, are not just women's issues. These are human issues. And we really need to pursue justice on all levels for workers, women workers, all workers, workers around the globe, precarious workers, all sorts of workers. And so thank you, Karen, for being a voice for workers and for women, and for bringing us all together in solidarity tonight. I want to thank everyone who joined us virtually on Zoom and on YouTube this evening. As I said, this event has been recorded by Between the Lines. So if you're looking to go back to find out more, whether from the conversation itself or about how to buy the book and how to read the book, you can find this recording. Karen, Mary, Pat, thank you for everything you've said tonight. Thanks for sharing our evening together, and thank you to Between the Lines for publishing this important book. And I don't know if there's any final thoughts that any of our panelists want to make before we go.
Well, if I would very much like to thank you, Jane, for the great job you did preparing for this and keeping it moving. And thank you so much. And thanks everybody for coming.
It's been a true pleasure and an honor. Thank you to all of you. And I can't wait until we can get together in whatever space it is we can. So good night to everyone. And once again, if you haven't yet bought the book, please find your way to Between the Lines and buy Karen's wonderful book. Thank you to everyone, and good night.